General Excelmans, whose mission it was to follow the king and princess, had advised that the king and his family had left Lille to go on to Ghent. Marshal Massena had proclaimed the empire in Toulon. All over France, the tricolor was flying. In the midst of his many occupations, the emperor did not forget the zeal and devotion of a few of his public servants in Elba. Monsieur Poggi de Talavo was foremost in his trust, which was all the more honorable for the magistrate, as it was deserved. It was especially in the evening, when going to bed, that the emperor would receive him and chat with him. It was through this magistrate that the Albans and Corsicans had their requests for jobs and help submitted to the emperor. All received jobs, bonuses, or allowances. Paoli, Brignoli, and Marcaggi shared in his generosity. For Brignoli's son, I asked for admission to boarding school with a full scholarship and clothing allowance, which the emperor granted. When Monsieur Pont de Hérol, detained in the Chateau d'If by Marshal Massena, returned to Paris to reward his zeal and devotion, the emperor named him prefect of Lyon, with an allowance of 20,000 francs out of his purse. Baron Galiazzini received a prefecture of Angers with 10,000 francs from the purse. In addition, these gentlemen received their travel and relocation expenses. Monsieur Poggi received a temporary salary of 12,000 francs. Two men whose distinguished services were recognized by the emperor, General Baron Breillet and Colonel de la Baudoyer, were made counts and peers of France. The former received a command of Young Guard Division and was made a chamberlain, governor of the Chateau de Versailles and the Trianon, and commander of the Lyon National Guard. His pay amounted to 100,000 francs, to which the emperor added an income of 6,000 francs drawn on the Orleans Canal. The second was made a general, ADC, to the emperor. Both are mentioned in the St. Helena will for 100,000 francs each. Informed that a purge had just taken place in the palace of a few former servants who did not inspire enough trust for the job of porter of inside stairs, because it was said they had remained in the service of Louis XVIII, I mentioned this to the emperor. I told him that among them was a father of a man who had accompanied him to Elba. I had been told of this by him and couldn't help being touched by the sorrow he felt over it. The emperor was much upset that he should thus be ridiculed, and ordered that those employees be retained in their positions. Although all services had resumed just as if the emperor had never left France, His Majesty wanted the chief servants on Elba to remain as such in Paris. Thus Totin remained as first butler, Pierron head of the pantry, Chauvin head of the stables, and Archambault and Matthias in charge of the footmen. A caricature insulting to Louis XVIII was brought to the emperor's quarters without anyone knowing how it had gotten there. The person who had left it obviously had access there, but didn't boast of it. It was only that evening I heard that it had been found by the emperor on his mantelpiece, and he had tossed into the fire after a scant look. The emperor had been too much exploited for the past 11 months by the press and similar pictures not to know how little importance one should assign to such trash. The haste with which the king had departed forced his staff to neglect some of his furniture and belongings. The furniture was sent back into storage. The prince's portfolio was still on his table, open letters in the drawers. The emperor had a look at them, learning from them that many people who showed him a great deal of zeal had shown no less for the Bourbons. It was of little interest for these purposes, but what will give a perfect understanding of the emperor's kindness is the fact that he revealed nothing of this and continued to consider as sincere the sentiments expressed to him. It was part of the emperor's wisdom and experience of men not to judge them too severely and to take into consideration the inconstancy of their impressions and feelings. His Majesty had all these letters locked up in the king's portfolio and kept all the status reports or memoranda that had been published in the past 9 months. When he had a free moment, the emperor would glance through them. There were, he said, in St. Helena, not mystical books, as had been said, but more than 500 secret reports and major petitions. 5 boxes were also found inside the drawers of this table. One of these, in a malachite lined with gold, contained the portrait of Madame de Savoie, wife of the prince. Another, made of turtle shell, showed a picture of a hunt at Fontainebleau, and on the other side a map of that residence. The third, a landscape drawn in ivory on an enameled gold box, was the work of Dieppe. The fourth, made of black turtle shell, had on its lid a picture in ivory showing the Queen, Louis XVI, the Dauphin, and Dauphine surrounded by angels. The fifth was an enameled gold box containing a medal of the king, newly minted, and a silver medal of Pius VII. The emperor handed me these snuff boxes, telling me to take good care of them. They went to St. Helena and were returned to the imperial family after the King of Rome's death. Monsieur de Blacas' correspondence and that found in the trunks in the bodyguards' quarters were inspected by 4 commissioners from the Senior Justice Department, the police, and the Ministry of the Interior. The emperor did not want the police alone to be in charge of this, not wanting the signers of the letters to be exploited, and sensing they might be. In the same papers was a letter from the chambermaid of Princess Pauline's that seemed to have been written in a fit of temper. The princess's habits were described, her dress, her wardrobe, all that could concern a woman seeking to please. A guard artillery officer who had obtained her favors was named. It was also mentioned the emperor, whose hands were handsome and well kept. The incident was related of the time when, while supervising the furnishings of the princess's quarters, he had badly burned his fingers on a brazier without showing the slightest emotion, but finding an inkwell at hand, had dipped his fingers in it, then wrapped them in his handkerchief. That was true. Many other things were said also, but what an atrocious libel, and had been added in another handwriting, was that the emperor was sleeping with the princess, and in the same hand the words, to be printed. Monsieur de Talleyrand's assets had been sequestered. At his residence, letters addressed to the Duchess of Angoulême were found, still sealed. Prince Joseph, who lived in Switzerland, arrived in Paris as soon as he learned of the emperor's arrival. Of all his brothers, this was one that the emperor liked best. He had not left a good impression with the Parisians of his conduct in 1814. One day in Elba, the emperor said of him to Count Bertrand that he had one of the more enlightened minds, honest hearts, and noble characters to grace a throne, but that nature had destined him to private life, as his virtues, education, and talents were much too refined for business matters. The prince was a living image of the emperor, with finer features and a fresher face, perhaps, too, a narrower forehead. The interview was most touching, and they were hurried to fall into one another's arms when they first caught sight of each other. In St. Helena, the emperor always spoke of this prince with a deeply felt affection. Recognition of the empire throughout all of southern France had put an end to the captivity of Countess Bertrand and a few wives of civil servants who had boarded the same vessel she had, and soon they arrived in Paris one after the other. Cipriani and Madame Bellini also arrived. The later, wife of a Polish colonel attached to the army staff, had been on Princess Pauline's personal staff in Elba. Her husband had been ordered to return to his station, and she was alone in Paris. As she knew no one there, she wrote to me about her problems and told me of her needs. The emperor had noticed her at the princess's, and I mentioned her to His Majesty that same evening. He told me to remit her 4,000 francs out of his purse, and to have her let me know if she was again in difficulty. He asked me to convey all her thanks to the emperor. A few days later, she received a dinner invitation and was able to offer her thanks to His Majesty in person. From all sides, speeches and proclamations by the troops and the generals were reaching the emperor. Baron de la Bouillerie, former treasurer to the emperor, asked to be allowed to justify his actions to His Majesty, who would not forgive him for having handed over his treasure to Orleans. The emperor felt that if he received him, Monsieur de la Bouillerie would easily convince him that his conduct had not been a matter of courage, but all a matter of circumstances, and as it was his intention to keep Monsieur Pérouse, his treasurer at Elba, in this post, he refused to see him. Marshal Augereau wrote him a private letter assuring him of his sincere devotion, denying he had ever betrayed him, Having read it, the emperor threw it in a fireplace, no doubt recalling the marshal's lack of politeness. During their meeting in the south on his way to Elba, and the infamous proclamation by which he insulted him in his misfortune, and which the emperor only learned of later, this same marshal sent a letter to the 14th Military Division, which he commanded for the king. That was just as indecent toward de Bourbon. It was the time for regrets over errors committed. The emperor offered his regrets on the death of the Prince of Neuchâtel, Berthier, who had fallen out a window at his Bamberg palace where he was staying. The prince had left him rather unexpectedly at Fontainebleau, promising to return, and had never reappeared. Was this death intentional or an accident? The first conclusion was that which prevailed among the public. The emperor was assured of the contrary by the prince's butler, who was in Paris and whom the emperor summoned in order to know the truth. Before this catastrophe, the emperor had said jokingly, "What, I wish to see Berthier in his bodyguard uniform." The emperor did not approve of the major general of the Grand Army donning the uniform of a captain in Louis XVIII's bodyguard. But had Berthier come to him, he would have welcomed him and opened his arms to him, offering his trust and restoring his rank of major general, for which he was so well suited, said the emperor. Since returning to Paris, the emperor had gone out on foot only twice, in the evening with the Grand Marshal, both in overcoats. His Majesty wore a green one with a round hat, and the Grand Marshal a blue one, also with a round hat. The two of them would stroll along the Paris boulevards and streets without being recognized. It would have been difficult to recognize the emperor dressed this way. This exercise for his legs pleased him. It was during one of these walks that he stopped and told the Grand Marshal to have the Élysée Bourbon prepared, for there he could at once take the exercise he needed without business matters suffering, as he could attend to them while walking in the gardens of that large and airy residence. The emperor mentioned this to me that evening as he was retiring, saying that it would only take place after the review of the federated troops. I had received that day an invitation from Mademoiselle Georges of the Théâtre Français to go and see her. I told the emperor I had gone, and she had told me of important papers she had in her possession, compromising the Duke of Otranto Fouché to the highest degree. I told the emperor she assured me that all who were attached to his majesty disliked seeing the trust he placed in this minister. The emperor laughed and replied, "I have my eye on him." Did she not tell you she was having difficulties? No, sire. She only mentioned her desire to hand these papers over to your majesty in person. I know what that is. Caulaincourt mentioned it to me and said she was experiencing some difficulties. Give her 20,000 francs from my purse. A few days later, he received from her the information she wished to hand over herself, and she was able to thank the emperor for his generosity to her. The emperor often came to the rescue of major artists in the capital, or even awarded them indemnities without their requesting it. Talma and some other artists were honored several times by his munificence. The emperor liked the arts and sciences, but was too busy during the day to give any time to them. He had chosen lunchtime to receive distinguished artists and scientists, and he then talked with them of science or literature, which were of great interest to him. During the 100 days, at one of these luncheons, he told Talma, to whom he had shown some kindness, "Well, Talma, it was reported to me in Elba that you had taught me how to behave on the throne." Talma replied, laughing, "Sire, it does the master too much honor, for assuredly your majesty behaves very well in that position, and people forget that I am the one coming here to profit from your majesty's comments." Isabey was among the artists the emperor rewarded. He and others had been received at Malmaison during the days of the consulate. It is untrue that these artists allowed themselves the liberties and bad taste attributed to them, which later forced the emperor to keep them at a distance. All of them recognized in the chief of state too high a position and mind to allow themselves liberties in speech or action. The time for their visits were changed, but the emperor remained no less their protector. Far from being kept away, Isabey became the drawing master of Empress Marie Louise, and during the 100 days, several received bonuses, which I was charged with distributing. During the first weeks after the emperor's arrival in Paris, the apartments of the empress and the king of Rome were opened. Workmen were assigned there, and work continued. It was believed at first that the princess was about to arrive with her son, but soon the opposite became obvious, and it became known that we would have to face a formidable coalition being assembled against France, in which Austria was taking part. Even while dealing with the foreign powers, the emperor was fully convinced he needed an outstanding victory in order to dissolve that coalition. So he neglected nothing at home or abroad to ensure its success. Special commissioners were sent out. The 23 military divisions, military aides, and generals were sent to all points of the kingdom to inspect and strengthen the forts and threatened locations, and to take advantage of the national spirit. The arms manufacturers and the Paris armorers were busy day and night manufacturing weapons. In the face of such great danger, our most renowned citizens seemed to doubt success. Marshal Massena said one day to Cipriani, who told me of it in St. Helena, "Everything must be begun again. I can see but one way to escape this. As the sovereigns want no part of the emperor, let him surrender his crown at the Champ de Mai. The war will become a national war. He is young enough to succeed in such a great venture, and to make the kings regret not having recognized that he alone can be mediator between the old and new ideas." I replied, "But this would be a republic. It would no doubt make kings tremble, but could not this revolutionary hydra cut down once by the emperor surface again? The emperor's powerful hand could fail, bringing back Jacobinism of 93. That all still remember. It is better to accept the sacrifice the emperor has made of his person and for us to share his cavalry." Prior to leaving the Tuileries for the Élysée, the emperor reviewed the federated troops. An awkward precaution had been taken. The emperor was passing along the front row on horseback when he noticed some grenadiers running to follow him. He stopped immediately and angrily told them to go away, while he proceeded alone slowly among the federated troops. I was standing at one of the Tuileries windows. Hurt by a precaution offensive to the men being reviewed, I cannot say how happy I was to see the emperor put an end to a proceeding that gave the impression he was suspicious. Cries of "Vive l'Empereur" emanating from all ranks greeted his passage. He recognized among these a gunner who had served with him in Toulon, asked him about his assignment, and promised to look into it. The emperor's enemies were circulating the most offensive rumors about this review. He said, "Let them talk. They are not decent people, but the sort we must endure." Others criticized the emperor for stopping this popular movement, to which he replied, "The popular movement was not halted. It was normalized. It was just as large as between 1789 and 1792. But then we had 3 years to arm ourselves, and here we had but 40 days. Then we were attacked by an army of only 80,000 men, this time by 600,000 men. If in 1792 we'd been attacked by as few as 300,000 men, Paris would have been captured in spite of the nation's energy and the 3 years it had to get organized." On May 21st, the emperor moved into the Élysée. It was there that Prince Lucien, whom the emperor had not seen for many years, came and threw himself into his arms. His opinions had often been contrary to the emperor's, but he admitted in truth that no heart ever beat more patriotically for France than that of his brother Napoleon. Power had been offered him by the emperor during his stay in Italy. The prince always refused it, not only because he considered it a pitiful present, but because the offers were made under conditions that offended his domestic feelings. Faced with the emperor's prestigious return and the imminence of the danger which threatened France, he did not hesitate to come and offer his help to the emperor. The arrival of the prince was a great joy for the emperor's friends and the patriots. Time away from the motherland had modified his principles. He had come to appreciate the great character and leadership of the man he had left as head of the French Republic. And he had become convinced that in ascending to the imperial throne, his brother had never for a moment ceased to be a patriot. In these difficult times, he brought the assistance of his popularity and his talent, so to speak. The meeting was most touching. All the past was forgotten in the embrace of the two brothers, joined by Prince Joseph, witness to this fraternal scene. The three spent an hour together. The emperor summoned me and told me to bring his great sash of the Legion of Honor, which I brought on a silver platter. The emperor took it and put it over the neck of the prince, who embraced him and thanked him, and a few moments later they parted. Prince Lucien, who had entered the room without any decoration, left it with the great sash. This insignia bore witness to all he met of the reconciliation that had just taken place and the prince's modification of his principles. A staff was awaiting him at the Palais Royal, where he then went. Count de la Casse was part of it, and an entire household organization had been made available to him. This residence soon became a meeting place for literary figures, artists, and patriots. He spoke to each in his own language, reminding the most ardent of these friends what Jacobin democracy had been and the setback it had caused the people's emancipation. In this moment of danger to France, it was necessary to work together toward the constitutional order the emperor wished to establish. The emperor was pleased by this unexpected return of his brother. The prince was taller than the emperor, whom he resembled very much, with less regular features. His smile seemed pleasant to me, and he appeared happy to be among his family. The emperor had placed in his drawing room the fox bust sent to him by Lady Damer. This lady received in exchange a snuff box decorated with the portrait of the emperor, surrounded by diamonds. One evening, as he was retiring, the emperor spoke to me of paintings he wished to commission, and that were ordered, of a few scenes that had occurred along his way. He mentioned the monument when he came up to the 5th Line Regiment, that when the Elban Grenadier introduced his blind 90-year-old father and his young brother who wished to follow him, and that when Colonel de la Baudoyer presented him with his regiment's eagle that he had kept, which the emperor grasped and kissed. Since the emperor's arrival in Paris, he had tried to win over men who, because of their social position and intellect, justly claimed to have influence on the opinions of the Paris salons. Monsieur Benjamin Constant was among and at the head of these, and the emperor had long talks with him at the time of the additional act of the empire, of which they were both proud. The emperor said he was no longer the 20-year-old lover. His friend Madame de Stael no longer had the influence over him that forced me to banish both of them because of their prejudice in constantly opposing me. On April 22nd, the additional act to the imperial constitution was published. This declaration paralyzed the momentum that I had noticed since my arrival. That day, I saw men sincerely attached to the emperor speak to me of it with bitterness. Had the emperor asked me about the effect produced by this act, as he sometimes did, I would have told him. But that same evening, he went to bed appearing preoccupied and did not mention it to me. During his stay at the Élysée, the emperor would come and attend mass at the Tuileries, receiving people afterward, and then going back to his residence. It was during one of these trips back that I told him Madame Pelepre had notified me of her arrival in Paris. Countess Valeska was also there. The emperor had learned this through the Duke of Vicenza, Caulaincourt. She arrived from Naples. The emperor had not seen her since her visit to Elba. He sent me to inquire how she was and to tell her to come during the day with her son. Madame Pelepre was then a ravishing beauty and had been noticed by the emperor during a trip he made to Normandy in 1812. She was staying with her family in Lyon when the emperor arrived there on his return from Elba. She shared in her heart and soul the excitement of the Lyon population, and the emperor sent me to her house. The lady had been in Lyon for only a few days, and he had much to learn by talking to her. The difficulty was to find an hour in the midst of all the bustle around him and the orders he was sending out in all directions. He was only able to grant her an audience at a late hour of the evening, business having prevented an earlier time. The emperor's relations with Countess Valeska had preceded his marriage to Empress Marie-Louise. Those with Madame Pelepre came after. If these affairs were rare in Empress Josephine's time, they became more frequent during the second marriage. He concealed these affairs, saying that more than once he had avoided falling into traps set for him, knowing well that a precipice could be hidden under flowers. It must be said that the emperor was very much in love with Empress Marie-Louise. The only reproach he made to that princess was not making enough effort to please the ladies of the court, who, accustomed to Josephine's graciousness, noticed this difference. Perhaps they forgot that, born to the throne, used to homage and respect, she didn't feel obligated to please them, and the natural shyness she showed in public was taken for aloofness. She had a great deal of affection for her lady-in-waiting, the Duchess of Montebello, but showed only kindness towards the others. The emperor attributed to her all the qualities that would make her loved. He said she was kind, gentle, affable, and even playful in her normal relations. Here's the opinion of Queen Caroline, sister of the emperor. This princess's judgment will not come under suspicion. She did not much like either of her sisters-in-law, Empress Josephine or Marie-Louise. When she was in Paris in 1838, she had her lady companion write to me, "Today, May 5th, the anniversary of the emperor's death, the queen wishes to spend the evening and have dinner at home. She's inviting you, Madame Marchand, and your daughter to come dine with her. Monsieur Menival will also be there." The conversation was entirely devoted to the memories of the empire. She told us the advantage Josephine had over Marie-Louise was in understanding the French mind and having been able to make good use of this in the emperor's interests. She was infinitely kind, and Marie-Louise not less so, but people talked less about it. The aim of one of them was to achieve the maximum impact, whereas the other, who was opposed to any form of affectation, did not strive for this. Being 19 years old, she had a charming figure. Her bearing was full of dignity, freshness, perhaps too much. She had charming blonde hair and hands and feet, leaving nothing to be desired. She was cultured, and from Braunau to Compiègne, she responded to all speeches addressed to her with facility and ease that attested to this. The word ninny she was said to have used as a compliment when addressing the Prince Arch-Chancellor is entirely a lie. She was too familiar with the French language not to know the meaning of the expressions she used. The Queen Caroline, who had been named superintendent of the Empress's household and sent by the Emperor to greet her, said that the princess had been most gracious towards everyone. She did not part from the people who had accompanied her heart from Vienna with some emotion, which did honor to her kind heart, but she did so with courage. During the journey, she covered only small distances each day and was greeted with receptions wherever she went. Every morning when she arose, there was a letter from the emperor, brought from Paris by a page who would return with the reply. She told us that the emperor was very anxious to meet her, and several times cursed the ceremonies and feasts that delayed this meeting, which occurred only in Soissons, where a camp had been set up to receive the princess. But the emperor was growing impatient and proceeded there one day before the princess. When he learned she was only 10 leagues away, he left along with the King of Naples to go meet her. The emperor often said that when the two carriages met, he jumped out of his and into hers, and the princess's first words, after a moment of silence, had been that the portrait brought her by the Prince of Neuchâtel was not very flattering. The emperor had been enthusiastic about this flattery and asked her what advice she had received when coming to meet him. She replied, "To obey you in all matters." After stopping a few moments in Soissons, their majesties, accompanied by a king and queen of Naples, arrived in Compiègne. The emperor, whose appearance was always very neat, had taken even greater care than usual to appear to his best advantage. At one of this morning receptions at the Élysée, I informed the emperor that Monsieur Corvisart, back in Paris, was in the next room with Dr. Ferraud. The emperor had him come in. Not seeing him dressed as head doctor, he said to him, "Ah, Corvisart, you're wearing the garb of the Institute." "Sire, I have retired, but remain always available to your majesty." The emperor complimented him on his student, Dr. Ferraud, whom he said he believed to be as enlightened as he was modest. Then a moment later he said to him purposefully that he had seemed in a great hurry to leave the empress in Vienna in spite of her health requiring his care, since he had prescribed her taking the waters in Aix rather than facing the climate in Elba that could have harmed her. Monsieur Corvisart, slightly embarrassed, replied that indeed he had recommended taking those waters so that if she went to Elba, the empress would arrive there in better health. The emperor talked about one thing and another with him, and as he was ready to go into his study, Monsieur Corvisart asked permission to present his nephew, his former page, now a captain in the cuirassiers. The emperor had come in, and Monsieur Corvisart said in introducing him, "Sire, this is the stuff majors are made of." "I shall give him the opportunity to become one," replied the emperor, after speaking kindly and encouragingly to the young officer. The emperor was impatiently awaiting the arrival of Monsieur Balouhet, former superintendent to Empress Josephine, whom the emperor had assigned to Empress Marie-Louise because of his strict honesty. He knew that he had to leave Vienna, stop in Munich to see Prince Eugene, and return to France via Belfort. Orders had been given so that the telegraph in that city would inform Paris of his arrival there. Having been so advised, the emperor calculated how much time it would take to travel from Belfort to Paris, and had a sentry posted at his house so that he would come immediately to the Élysée as soon as he arrived, no matter what the time or his travel clothing. On April 28th, Monsieur Balouhet arrived in Paris. He came immediately to see the emperor, who kept him almost 2 hours. The emperor had a great deal to learn from him about what was happening in Vienna, and all that Prince Eugene had passed on to him on the subject was of the utmost interest to him. He learned about Monsieur de Talleyrand's activities with regard to the March 13th declaration and the commitments he had made with the coalition. He again was told that had his departure from Elba been delayed by a few days, the sovereigns would have already departed for their realms. Monsieur de Talleyrand would not have obtained the March 13th declaration, and His Majesty's landing would have had maximum impact. Prince Eugene informed him that the Allied forces could not enter France before July. The emperor then said to Monsieur Balouhet, with a look of great satisfaction, "Then I don't give a damn about them. My affairs will have been settled by then." The prince also advised him to arrange to make the war a national issue as much as possible, at a time when he would have all Europe stirred up against him, and to be aware of the Duke of Otranto, Fouché, who was already plotting in Vienna. He informed him of the names of a few generals and colonels whom he should not trust, and gave him details on invading the enemy forces and the points that appeared most likely to be attacked. Monsieur Balouhet brought all these details, committed to memory, and many things might have escaped him. So the emperor said to him, "Go get some rest, and tomorrow bring back to me our conversation of today in writing." As he left, Monsieur Balouhet reiterated his fears about the Duke of Otranto, Fouché. The emperor said he had him under surveillance and would already have had him arrested and his papers seized, but was delaying until the return of an agent he had in Basel, as that minister's disgrace could undermine his mission. The emperor learned many particulars about the people who were close to Empress Marie-Louise and her entourage. 12 days later, in early May, his former secretary, Baron de Meneval, now on the empress's staff, confirmed to him what Monsieur Balouhet had said. The emperor had a meeting with him, also lasting several hours, and told him to come and see him every day at his levee. He handed me a letter from my mother expressing her fears that the emperor might not succeed in withstanding the formidable coalition that was forming, with Emperor Alexander at its head. Nothing in all this news gave any indication that Marie-Louise, in this gathering of kings, was putting forth her rights as wife and mother to turn aside the storm that was gathering against France and the emperor. Was this princess already unworthy of the great name of Napoleon, as she was later? The emperor's fears regarding the King of Naples were unfortunately justified in spite of His Majesty's wish, expressed prior to leaving Elba, that he should not quit his kingdom. No sooner had he learned of the emperor's entrance into Paris than he decided on his own to advance into Italy. Did he fear the emperor's resentment? Did he wish to undo the immense harm he had done to France in 1814 by separating his interests from those of the emperor? Be that as it may, he marched into Italy, calling for independence at the head of 80,000 men. He had no doubt he could instill into his soldiers' souls the fiery courage that filled his own. He was mistaken. At first, he had success against troops taken by surprise, but soon afterwards, this fine and brilliant army was beaten on May 2nd and 3rd near Ancona and was never able to rally again. The emperor was extremely upset by his brother-in-law's invasion, and he sensed all the advantages the coalition against him could derive from it. Had this army, that a single month was enough to destroy, remained on the defensive, as the emperor had recommended to his leader, while commanded by a man as brave as Murat, it could have brought pressure to bear on Austria, saved its power for the emperor's interests, or at least weighed heavily in the ensuing negotiations. Instead, Austria refused to believe the sincerity of the emperor's promises regarding Italy, thought he was deceiving it, and from that premise decided to crush him with all the power of its monarchy. After his failure, King Murat had sailed to seek refuge in France, and the emperor learned of his landing in Gulf Juan with Madame Mère, Cardinal Fesch, and Prince Jérôme. The unfortunate prince remained hidden along the coast of Provence. War was imminent. He let the emperor know of his desire to serve in the French army as a general, but France could still remember the Treaty of Naples and the declaration of war by this king or viceroy of Italy at a time when all the powers were against her. The emperor did not accept. He arrived in person on the eve of battle. The emperor could have opened his arms to him and afforded him the opportunity to right his wrongs. France, being generous, would have forgotten the King of Naples' error, remembering only the glory of one of her children on 20 battlefields, ready again to shed his blood for her. It was, I believe, about such conditions that the emperor added in St. Helena, I would have entrusted him with the command of my cavalry. It would have achieved marvels under his command. All know the tragic end of this brave and unfortunate prince. The emperor in St. Helena felt that the Calabrians had been less cruel toward Murat than the British government was being toward him. The emperor, satisfied with the actions and conduct of General Grouchy in Lyon and the confidence he had inspired, made him a marshal. It was said before and during the 100 Days that the emperor continued to mistrust the great lords of old, who were said to have betrayed him. The emperor responded to that criticism in St. Helena, saying that the great lords of old under Napoleon were Frenchmen like anyone else, and those who were devoted to him had behaved well. He cited Choiseul, Praslin, Montesquieu, Bouveau, Ségur, and others. He said, I brought former noblemen into my army and even exiles without it ever being the worse for it. And why? Because it was known that in the army everything is granted on the basis of merit. It is not enough to be a great lord. One has to be brave. And in this respect, the old nobility was no less so than the new. What I had to fear from them, had I not stricken them all from the list of exiles? As soon as the emperor heard of Madame's arrival in Paris, he got into his carriage and went to her house, where his brothers had gathered. It had been a long time since Madame's heart had throbbed with happiness as great as during this family reunion. Princess Pauline, too ill to undertake this voyage, had remained in Italy. On June 1st, the emperor opened the Champ de Mai, his 3 brothers with him, an imperial dress just as he was. It was both a patriotic and religious celebration. The emperor was in a good mood. He had gone from the Élysée to the Tuileries for this solemn affair, to don there the garb in which he was to appear in public. Count de Montesquieu, in full costume, presided over the dressing, and the emperor had the goodness to praise me to him in the most flattering terms. Once the emperor was dressed, Count de Montesquieu put around his neck the collar of the Order of the Legion of Honor and fastened on his sword. The weather, undecided in the morning, turned fair, and the emperor left the Tuileries to the sound of artillery to proceed to an école militaire. I was there already When he arrived, a throne had been erected in front of the building. A semicircular wall had been built in front of this throne, forming an immense hall with the sky as its ceiling. There were rows above which the names of the department were written, showing the deputies where each was to go, and many tiers of seats had been reserved for the public, where a large number of women in brilliant apparel could be seen. After a speech to the deputies, greeted with cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" he climbed down from the throne with his brothers, surrounded by his senior officers, and proceeded to the center of the Champ de Mai. An altar had been prepared there at the top of many steps where it could easily be seen. After offering thanks, the emperor, his hand on the gospel, took an oath of fidelity to the imperial constitution. He distributed eagles to the National Guard and the Imperial Guard, who swore to defend. There were deputations from all the army regiments gathered together on the Champ de Mars. When they returned with their eagles to their brothers in arms, all were able to confirm the magical influence the emperor exercised over the masses. All spirits were electrified, and cries of "Vive l'Empereur" were heard coming from the troop deputies and the huge crowd. The same spirit was present as that of 1790 that led the nation to such great results. After the parade of troops, the emperor went to the Tuileries to the sound of artillery. That evening, he returned to the Élysée, tired but happy in the enthusiasm he had inspired. There were huge banquets where the army and the National Guard fraternized. The emperor's life during the period of the 100 Days was most active and not, as some claimed, given over to slumber by reason of his corpulence. But a change had occurred in society. It was easy for him to see that men were less docile than before.